I am absolutely convinced that what's going on in Gaza is genocide because the thing speaks for itself. But Gaza is a killing ground. My grandchildren will be learning in school about who did what in the worst crime of the 21st century. Who was complicit in that crime? The public rhetoric from Tel Aviv and the honest rhetoric from Tel Aviv is, no, we're going to eliminate Hamas. Well, good luck. You need to eliminate the military activities of Hamas, maybe, but you can't eliminate the Palestinian right to their own future. The Western approach to Gaza is complicity. The Western or global approach to Sudan is indifference. Seeing the freedom with which the settlers are able to simply bomb a village and move people out so they can go in and farm. I mean, how bad is that? It's extraordinary. It's a bit like Israel going in and bombing Soeda, which is what I last remember as a foreign country. It's called Syria, and deciding on who polices it. I know this lady, Francesca Albanese, and I've admired her, for her term, and I often speak to her about what we think is happening, and she's always incredibly helpful. And she's the most courageous woman in many ways that I know, because of course they're death threats. This happens. The brutal and casual sanctioning of somebody who's employed by the UN to do what she has done is quite extraordinary.
Welcome to this episode of Expert Witness. I'm your host, Sondos Asem, and today it's a pleasure to be joined by Martin Griffiths. He's the former United Nations aid chief, and we're going to discuss the situation in Gaza and Sudan, where two of the worst humanitarian crises have been taking place over the past 2 years. Martin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's very, very nice to be here.
Nice to meet you too. Martin, you've had over 50 years of professional experience as a humanitarian, a British diplomat, and a conflict mediator with the United Nations and other global institutions. In our conversation today, we're particularly keen to hear from you on your experience as the UN's Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, which is the top humanitarian aid position at the United Nations. In this capacity, you served for 3 years between July 2021 and July 2024 under the leadership of Secretary General Antonio Guterres. That means you presided over the UN's humanitarian aid efforts in the first 9 months of Israel's devastating onslaught on Gaza.
Yeah.
So, Martin, based on that experience, could you talk to us on the situation in Gaza right now from your perspective? How bad is the situation?
Well, as you say, Summer, I've had 50 years of experience. I was a frontline aid worker in the Gaza of that time, which was in Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge were coming down to Thailand. You remember that, the killing fields. And so I had some experience, and it is nothing like what we're seeing today in Gaza. And it's sort of testimony that the aid workers, my former colleagues who are in Gaza, who are doing their best under incredibly difficult circumstances, have extraordinary trauma, which they never talk about, by the way, which is to their credit. Partly because it's nothing like the trauma of the Gazans and the Palestinians in the Strip, but it's because of frustration that they can't do their job. And this has been compounded recently, back to the situation, first of all, by the blockade from early March, as we know. Little bit loosened up of late, but not significantly, not something you could really touch on. And secondly, the extraordinary insertion by the US and Israel of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I actually object to them, partly because they, decry the name of humanitarian, because clearly they're not that. So that the situation for the people of Gaza, starvation, hunger, displacement, killing, wounding, losing their family, not knowing what the future is has never been as bad in Gaza as it is now after 21 months. And the aid community that I was involved in, as you said, has had to do extraordinary acrobatics, really, to try to do their job. And there's nothing more important for a humanitarian aid worker in a front line like they are than to be able to actually fulfill their mission. The frustration is when they fail, because they take responsibility for the lives lost. And that's to their credit, they do that. So Gaza is going nowhere as far as catastrophe. And everything you learn about it, you know it much better than me, suggests a very, very malign future.
What's special about Gaza that makes it different from other disasters and conflicts you've dealt with?
Well, I think that's a very good question. We have a sort of habit in the humanitarian community to say, what's the worst place? There's a sort of, a list of which is worse. Yemen, where I worked, not as a humanitarian, but as a mediator, as you know, was always cited to be the worst humanitarian disaster in the world because of the numbers of people of the total population affected by need. When we look at Gaza, we look at Sudan, because we're trying to sort of correlate the two miseries. The numbers in Sudan are obviously much bigger. I think 500,000 children have been killed. Famine has been formally declared. More famine will come, no end in sight, no prospect for the future. Gaza, to answer your question directly, plays a unique and special and awful role in this time of history. Gaza is a place for massive impunity. We all know about the deaths of aid workers, the deaths of children, the deaths of mothers, the torching of schools, and so forth. It's so egregious that it also sends lessons for other parts of the world. I mean, it's a dreadful performance by the Israeli Defense Forces. The killings recently, of course, in the GHF areas are just part of the awful story that the people of Palestine have
The
been
Gaza Humanitarian Foundation.
Sorry, exactly that. And as I said before, what happens in Gaza doesn't stay in Gaza, as you know, and of course other conflicts, because Israel is getting away with terrible crimes of the people of Palestine, including in the West Bank. They're getting a slightly increased criticism from the West, not so much obviously from Washington, but they're not actually being held to account in any way for the daily crimes they're doing. And that incident where, the Palestinian Red Crescent workers were killed on video, we don't need any more than that to tell us what's going on there. So Gaza is a message to bad actors in the world of conflict that you can do this. Why not create a so-called humanitarian foundation under your instructions to provide aid and then block the UN from doing it? Why not? Nobody's going to say no. There's been nothing more than Geneva closing down the foundation office here in Geneva. That's not good enough. So I think Gaza has a totemic impact. First of all, in the incredible depths of suffering, the appalling, since the Second World War, destruction, but also because it shows people they can do what they like.
Is it your assessment that the situation now amounts to a genocide?
Yes, I do think so. I came out with that statement, as you know, recently. I actually talked to a lot of human rights lawyers before doing so. I am a lawyer, incidentally, by the way. And there's a legal term in at least British law, it's a Latin term of all things, which says res ipsa loquitur, which is the thing speaks for itself in law. I am absolutely convinced that what's going on in Gaza is genocide because the thing speaks for itself. Obviously, final determination, any pursuit of accountability, which is absent today, lies with the International Court of Justice. But we can, with confidence, and we should, with conscience, tell it what it's like, and that is a genocide. There's no question anymore. We don't need any more investigations. We haven't had any investigations, generally speaking, of this either. There's no inside truth coming to us. But I feel very, very strongly from first-hand information from my community, the humanitarian community, that this is what's going on.
And at what stage, Martin, have you reached that conclusion?
Well, that's a great question because everybody, even including me, is cautious about coming to that kind of conclusion. Genocide is a very storied crime, as you know, and it's a subject of extraordinarily lucid and disciplined analysis by experts and lawyers and so forth. It's a very controversial statement to say it's a genocide. I'm sure that's the burden of your question. So I, at the beginning of the war, after October the 7th, with the humanitarian community, decided to, first of all, appeal for a permanent ceasefire, not pause, not temporary, not what we're seeing actually in recent months, but to do it properly, and to end the war with a clear alignment of war aims. Never there, not yet now. And then I think we moved on from that in those first 6, 7, 8 months to an assessment that the horror is getting worse and the horror is deliberate. And we were and thus, eventually for me, genocide, which has been in the last 6 months, a reality in my mind. And we've been helped by this, astonishingly, by the very clear public statements of Israeli ministers and the Prime Minister himself. They do speak very clearly about their intentions. As you know, they talk clearly about the humanitarian cities now, which are only places of transit to deport them. They speak very clearly of taking the command and control of the Gaza Strip and putting in settlers and getting rid of Palestinians. The motive, which is part of obviously the legal framework for this, they have lit it up, on frequent occasions. They have no feeling that that's a wrong thing to do. They think it's exactly right. And the problem is with genocide, which is a horror in itself, of course, families killed, moved, killed, is that it does nothing for Israel's security. We've learned since 1945 that security is mutual. We've known that, which is why there's nuclear deterrence and a non-proliferation. That disastrously tested truth doesn't seem to hold anybody's opinion in these cruel capitals.
If it's that obvious, Martin, why are UN officials not using the term?
Great question. And I can imagine if I was there, I'd be one of the ones you're asking, talking about. So fair enough. I think it's this, and I think it goes to a deeper truth, which is very particularly true about humanitarian agencies and their leaders, who they're my gang, if you like, that they don't do anything to jeopardize their possibility of operation. You know this as well as I. So they don't want to speak out against an armed group in a particular place or a government in a particular place who could give them access. And if they say this, they won't get access. So they see this as their priority requirement is to keep the silence which allows them to operate. Now, I understand that. That's been there ever since I was born. And there's been a very clear reticence. Humanitarian operators are not activists. They are people trying to do their particular job. Now, that's dying fast because of the terrible situation in both Gaza and Sudan and beyond, but those two, I think. Because in Gaza, you're not holding to solidarity with the people of Palestine in Gaza or in the West Bank if you don't say this. You're not speaking to the truth of what you see every morning. You're hiding it. So in Gaza, we see a progressive move, and what we hear from senior UN officials, to their credit, is an entry point to telling the truth. The truth as I see it, perhaps, maybe they don't, which is that it's collective punishment, that it's a crime against humanity, that we haven't seen any investigations. We know all these statements. And I think that's their way of trying to do their job in the most difficult of circumstances. I don't have that constraint.
Your successor, Tom Fletcher, has actually used the term while addressing the Security Council in May this year, asking member states, quote, "Will you act to prevent genocide?"
Yes.
Do you welcome that statement? And what's your response to this question? Has the UN failed to prevent genocide in Gaza?
I think it's a very good statement. I have a high admiration for Tom Fletcher, and particularly his evolving public statements and appearances in the Council and elsewhere on the Middle East. And I think what he's saying there is a very clear way of saying something could be happening, which I think it is, genocide, but something could be prevented as well, which is a less invasive or admonitory term. And I think he's very wisely, because of the things we've discussed, trying to cover the ground of both. I think it's very good. It's not a start. He's been talking about these things for some time, but it's not going to last. And you know what this is. This is a historic global event that's going on in Gaza. My grandchildren will be learning in school about who did what in the worst crime of the 21st century, who was complicit in that crime. And as a very good friend of mine, the Western approach to Gaza is complicity. The Western or global approach to Sudan is indifference. Complicity is something that doesn't go away over time. So I think that they're doing well. When you ask about whether the UN should have done more to prevent this, I think the UN member states, I think the Secretariat did its job. It spoke out. I did. Others did. Provided aid when we could. As Secretary General Guterres said when we were talking about reconstruction 6 months ago, he said, "I know Israel will not allow the UN to be involved in it." It's a truth, but a telling truth. But the UN member states, the Security Council, has been, shockingly absent with clear messages, let alone actions, for God's sake. And the General Assembly has been more, but it still holds back from its eventual power, which I think we will see, of actually taking the place of other organs to actually provide real serious judgments and condemnations. But it's still, I'm biased on this, it's still the place where I think we can find global truth. And its institutions include the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, as you know. And I think they're doing a very brave job, despite the vigorous antipathy of some.
Why is that the case? Why has the UN failed? You mentioned complicity in Gaza and indifference in Sudan. Why is that the case?
That's such a good question, because it's the kind of question that's been glaring us in the face, hasn't it, for this last 21 months? And yet we haven't got a good answer to it. We have answers like, the power of certain governments, obviously Israel and Washington and others, who are huge supporters of Israel, cannot be confronted. It will affect our economies. It will affect multilateral solidarity. It will rebound on NATO. It will have consequences elsewhere. That is almost certainly true. I'm one of those, and there are so many of us now. I'm just a small person shouting in the wind, is that it doesn't matter what happens to your interests. There's a moment in life, back to the complicity issue, when you just say no, when you just tell the truth, where you support the International Court of Justice rather than condemn it, where you do something on sanctions against Israel, and all that the ICJ has talked about, Albanese again recently. You don't measure this in whether you have better agreements in other areas. I think we've long got to that point where the desperate brutality and illegality of what's going on in Gaza allows any distraction from being true.
As a British diplomat, Martin, is the UK complicit?
I have to say, I think they could be a lot more robust. And they have an obligation to prevent, don't they? Because the International Court of Justice has spoken, and it imposes that obligation. The Geneva Conventions, never mind ICJ, have clearly imposed an obligation on, the parties to those conventions, which includes the United Kingdom, to do something about it. And at the very least, and it's not happening in the UK, by the way, so I'm trying to sort of answer your question. At the very least, you insist on, you commission, you pay for if necessary, the relevant investigations into what happened on this particular day. And we've seen very, very, very little of it. And I find that very disappointing. I understand, not quite firsthand, but I understand exactly why the UK is being careful. But I don't think this is the time for carefulness.
What could they do that they have not done?
Well, I think they need firstly to review the way in which not aid, but investment and arms sales and so forth go through from UK to Israel. The EU is talking about it, as you know, not particularly in a rapid way, but there is a first acknowledgement that this is actually an obligation. It's not an option. You can't put it off. It's for now. It should have been for earlier. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, I think they should see their role, particularly the UK, because it's not in the European Union. It has a democratic tradition. It has, as I was in the Foreign Office, a week ago talking to their directors. I mean, it has a very talented diplomatic force. Why haven't we seen, for example, more intervention on the issue in Sueda, with the bombing of Sueda and the removal from Sueda of the government, the administration of the time, by Israel? Why haven't we seen more outrage publicly stated and then acted on with these, not necessarily sanctions, but these obligations already existing? You don't need to create anything new to do that. And of course, the reason we haven't is because the UK treads a very difficult line in its different alliances.
Do you agree that Britain has a special historic responsibility towards Palestinians, and that so far it has betrayed this responsibility?
I'm not very invested in the idea of looking at historic obligations, because they bring with them the sense of imperial power, and I would rather move on from that to current obligations. I mean, the current obligations are quite enough, I think, to tell everybody in Europe how they need to act. And I see that as an overriding obligation. But yes, I think Britain, UK also thinks, look at its very prominent interest in Sudan. Of those obligations, in fact, not that I'm saying they should, but that they have a certain, what they call knowledge as well as obligation. Anywhere they come from is a good thing.
How about the EU? What's your reaction to their failure so far to take any action against Israel, particularly in light of the conclusions of the EU's own review on the EU-Israel Association Agreement, and the finding that Israel has breached Article 2 of the agreement pertaining to human rights provisions within the agreement. What's your reaction to the EU's failure to take a stance?
I was very impressed by Josep Borrell's fierce statement the other day, in which he particularly focused on the answer to your question, in which he said this is a disgrace, the EU is not living up to its founding values, it needs humanitarian and mediation world, is a power in the globe. There's no question, and they provide huge amounts of humanitarian aid. They are a force for good in international relations more generally, as I have observed. So why aren't they doing the walk now? And I think we know the answer because we see the discussions in Brussels, which is the power of consensus. You need all of the countries to come together on these things, and that's very difficult in a Europe which has very different views in different nations and different states. So I think that this is a challenge for the EU constitution, if you like, as well as the EU conscience, to do the right thing. I don't doubt that there are very significant leaders in Brussels, in the Commission and the Council, that want to do it right. I was not long ago, a couple of months ago, meeting the Commissioner, as you know, for External Affairs and Aid, who's very passionate about these things. But getting through the consensus obligation, I lived in Brussels for 3 years, 6 years ago, is really hard work. That's why, back to your earlier questions about UK is in a position, it doesn't need consensus from anybody because of its decision to leave the Union, to our dismay some years ago. So why not grab that? Why not say it clearly? Because it's only you, and only you are good and great and powerful. Because each voice, that's what's so wonderful about the demonstrations we see around the world, the extraordinary bravery of Palestinian supporters and students in the US, and the terrible way that they're being treated. It's an axiom of the humanitarian operation that one life is worth all lives. You save one person, and that is what you're there to do, and then go on and do everyone else, So it's the same about conscience. One voice is worth everybody's voice. Of course, that's technically not true because everybody's voice is necessary for change. But it's what you and I have to do, and what I had to choose to do, is to decide which side of history we're on.
What measures should the EU take to prevent further international law violations, in your view?
I think there are two broad things. One is, as discussed in the case of the United Kingdom, to investigate, and I know they're looking at this and they've done some work on it, but clearly to take quick and public and accountable action on the issues that the ICJ has asked member states to do, which is about investment, it's about arms sales, it's about support for the military operation in various ways, whether it's helping with websites or technical means or whatever, that the EU can do a much more swinging assessment of what they have to stop. And they're finding that difficult, back to consensus again. But I think that's the first obligation, and it follows law, because the law, as expressed by the International Court of Justice, thank God they exist, says that very clearly to us. There's a whole set of requirements that they have put out. And then the second thing is keep providing aid. Don't get lost in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, terrible trap. But also, thirdly, do investigations, commission investigations, pay for investigations, insist on them. Israel always talks after every act has happened, including the most egregious one, this last day or so, about killing the priest in Gaza of a Christian church, which was attacked, quote unquote, by mistake. Where's the investigation? Israel talks about doing one. We never see the outcome. It's not publicly accountable. And so for me, as a normal public sector person, that's not a real investigation. EU can be a serious support for that. They are a power.
And Martin, you've spoken about the GHF, or the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but I want to hear from you in more detail your take on this as an aid distribution mechanism in Gaza. What are its real objectives? Is it really humanitarian? And how damaging is it for humanitarian principles of impartiality, independence, and humanity that you abide by as a humanitarian?
I think it's a terrible project. I think it undermines humanitarian action globally, never mind in Gaza, where it has a direct impact on it. Look, I think what's happening here, and it goes back to the heart of your question, is that there's an attempt, in this case by Israel and the US through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, to recapture the support and understanding and affection, if you like, for doing humanitarian work. Because, we can claim it, they can claim it through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, how many thousands or millions of lunches have been distributed and so forth. And they want that because partly they were accused, of course, Israel were accused of not providing humanitarian aid, which is its obligation anyway as an occupying power. So they grabbed this opportunity to say, we're doing the work. The second aspect of it, as you know, which I think is egregious and wrong, is that because all UN and international NGO aid is being looted by the Hamas. Once again, one of these complaints which never is tested by evidence or by an accountable process. So they constructed this new framework whereby if you want real humanitarian aid done, it's done by this lot in the fortresses in the south of Gaza. And so we didn't like it in the beginning. None of us liked it. It had no reference, secondly, to humanitarian experience. I know personally in humanitarian operations across history, whether it's in Cambodia or Somalia or Ukraine or elsewhere, you do not provide humanitarian aid under the auspices of one warring party, and you do not do it within a military environment. So, thus, both the security contractors are camps to their distribution points, and now we have the evidence that they're killing people every day, every night, tells us this ain't humanitarian. This is an attempt to use humanitarian delivery as a way of claiming some credit because we're keeping the people alive. And the argument goes, as you know, that at least we're doing something. The UN isn't. I challenge that, of course, from the beginning, because the UN can do it. We saw it at the beginning of the ceasefire, of this latest ceasefire. And as the UN keeps saying, we have a track record of doing this. The other thing that is wrong with it, there's two things that I think are really fundamentally, operationally, or tactically wrong. One is the lure, as we all see, and I've said before, to bring the people who in need down to the south, run through these dreadful, terrible miles of the potential of looting and indeed now of killing. It's a lure for displacement to an area, the south, Rafah, and so forth of Gaza, where the Israelis have been very clear because they now want to build a city there to provide, a transit lounge for Gazans to leave the country, their country. So that's the first problem, aid as a lure for displacement. And secondly, and perhaps this sounds a bit technical, but I think it's important in terms of the argument. I'm not aware that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation does any monitoring of where aid goes once it's parceled out in the chaos of these distribution centers. No humanitarian agency in the public domain, and I know directly, would ever get away with providing aid by sort of shoving it off the back of a truck. You need to continue the monitoring, third-party monitoring, to make sure that it goes to the people who you decided are the priority. Well, they can't do it because they don't have access across the strip. But this is a dereliction of humanitarian duty and responsibility, never mind principles. So I think it's wrong on all these counts. And there's no possibility of companionship with them and between them and the UN effort. That's really sad because aid has now become a central discussion in the war and in the possible ceasefire, because of course it's largely going to be done again by the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and I just think that's plain wrong.
Martin, what if Israel puts conditions on the UN, for example, that they can come back to work in Gaza if they cooperate with the GHF mechanism, or for it to be part of humanitarian missions in a way that gives it international legitimacy. Would you find this acceptable?
No, I wouldn't find it acceptable. And the reason why I think I and all my former colleagues are saying this is because this is a precedent. This is the old, it doesn't stay in Gaza problem. This is a precedent which will be directly insisted on elsewhere. I mean, the Russians in the occupied areas of Ukraine will insist, as they do, by the way, as you know, on controlling aid. They keep repelling. I did a lot of work on Ukraine. They keep pushing back on aid from the international system to come through to the people under their administration. It's the same here, but more brutally and frankly more brazenly, which I think is quite shocking. So for them to ask for this is against the law, humanitarian law. It's against good practice. I think that the international humanitarian agencies in Gaza have shown that they can do the job if they're allowed to actually get food in and have control of it and distribute it. The idea that this recent move to allow about 170 trucks a day, I think, into Gaza was a deceptive in the sense, or distraction, because most of them were looted, as you know. They came through some crossing points where they were already subject to looting. They went up on certain roads, chosen, of course, by the IDF, which was also open to looting, and very little arrived at the intended destination. And then this was used as propaganda about how the UN fails. It's not the UN that's failing there, it's others.
If you were in Tom Fletcher's place right now, what would you have done to address the emergence of this new mechanism?
Well, I would have been quite straightforward in my condemnation of it. I wouldn't have had any illusions, and I think he has too. I mean, there's nothing between us on this, and he's directly, on the line here. But we wouldn't have had any other. I'm sure he doesn't. Wouldn't have any other illusions about whether public rhetoric would make much of a difference here. But we need to do it to preserve our soul, to preserve the humanitarian exceptionalism and privilege that's granted by law. So we have to do that. I would secondly do what I think Tom and his colleagues in the humanitarian agency are doing, is not actually offer the salve of cooperation with the Humanitarian Foundation. The argument goes, you need to cooperate with us because actually we all want to feed the people. Well, yeah, maybe we do. I'm not sure you do. So I think he should be quite firm on that. I think he has been. And he's been more and more declaratory in the Security Council, as we saw just, yesterday or the day before. Very strong speech. And that's not easy to do in his position, where you're challenging key member states of the United Nations, key donors, well, US less so now, but others as well. And the argument would go from many people to him, as it would have done to me. Your obligation is to deliver aid. Don't tell us about justice in the world. And I think he's brought the two together, and I'm very, very pleased he's done that.
You've addressed the role and obligations and complicity of Western states like the UK and the European Union. How about Arab states? Have they provided enough support for the UN and its humanitarian operations in Gaza?
Yes and no. Yes and no, because there's a story here that's not easily discovered about actually the levels of funding of humanitarian operations by Gulf states, by Arab states as well, is much, much bigger than we generally know. I know that the Emirates, for example, is providing a significant amount of aid to Gaza, which is kind of not in the public domain because it's swallowed by all these other issues that's going on.
How much are they providing?
I don't
Do you have
know.
figures or like a
No,
percentage
I
of the
don't.
total?
No, I can try and find out, and I'll send you for you to say. Okay, hundreds of millions anyway. I mean, a lot of money.
There
Um,
was a statement by the Emirati, I think, foreign minister, quite recently saying that they have provided almost more than 40% of humanitarian aid, but there was no way to verify this
no,
claim.
no, and they kind of oppose verification because they don't want to be subject to international oversight or monitoring, do they? I mean, they're a very special government, and so they don't like it. And Qatar is a bit different. Saudi Arabia disappointed in the UN after giving them $1 billion for Yemen some years ago. So it's complicated, but I think it's important to notice that actually Gulf states are doing more than many others on aid funding. Number two, they produced the Arab Plan. Egypt and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, didn't they? And Jordan, I think, for the future of Palestine, which is going through some discussion, including with member states of the West, including UK, I think, and France. That's very, very, very important, and it's very good that they did it, and it's against the sort of norms that we're seeing out of Tel Aviv or Washington. And they have not found it easy, you know this, firsthand, to come to a conclusive, consensual view on where this is all going. Now, I think they're getting closer to it. I think that the Saudis have been very clear when it comes to the Abraham Accords that the two-state solution needs to be very clearly, with its own pathway, acknowledged by all before they'll consider it. It'd be I think the Emirates could easily be there. I know Qatar is obviously there already. So they could be even more of a force for good than they are. I think Qatar and Egypt, by the way, have done a remarkable role in the mediation. I mean, it's not a popular thing to mediate with Hamas in this world today. Lots of brickbats, especially when it fails, and it always will fail until we get a resolution of the future. And I think they've done a great work. And I think it's been largely very, very principled. It's another topic, of course. Where's mediation going? But to have a united Gulf would be a miracle, wouldn't it? To dream of because of their power. It's great that they're doing the two-state solution conference, I think, later this month in New York, Saudi and France. So they have such reach, these states, not just because of their wealth, but because of their geography. We expect the best of them.
You've spoken about Egypt, but concerning its role in allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, Egypt is the only Arab state that shares a border with Gaza. Do you think it could have done better at the beginning of the war to at least allow more aid into Gaza? You were there as the UN's aid chief at the beginning of this conflict.
Yes, and I was in Cairo, actually, not long after October the 7th. And we went to the borders of Gaza, as close as I ever got to Gaza, because pretty soon Israel would never give me a visa, and I never got in. But we went from Cairo with Guterres, actually. So we had first-hand understanding of the feelings that were going on about the topic you're asking. I think it was difficult. I don't approve of it, by the way. I think it was difficult at that time to insist, because of the horror of October the 7th, which was, of course, long been out-horrored, if I may say so, by the events of the genocide in Gaza. But at the beginning, you remember this clearly, that there was this shadow cast across the sky of this atrocity. Now, nevertheless, Egypt, as you say, had the only access from another state to Gaza. And of course, it's through Rafah, and the Rafah corridor and so forth. And that's, topical right now, as we see. And Egypt had a very difficult hand to play, because they wanted, of course, which most states in the region would also want is not to have a flood of Palestinians coming into their territory. They've had this before through the Nakba, and they would want to see, therefore, the rights of Palestinians protected in their own territory. I think they might have done a bit more on the access to Rafah when it came down, months later, when it was much more imposed on them by Israel, that there should be, very, very controlled access. And I think that, at the time, I guess the rhetoric was not clear, as we have discussed today, about what's going on, genocide and so forth. But Egypt has made up for that in various ways, I think. I don't think they think about making it up, but it's just me speaking. But they have, through the Arab Plan, which they're a major author, through their mediation, which is very interesting that Egypt should be doing mediation. I met some of their senior officials in Doha back in the middle of last year before I left the UN. Very, very smart, knowledgeable people about the dynamics and the personalities. Qatar, obviously, the lead, but are doing a great job. But Egypt has done well, and I think on the whole, I'm very grateful for Egypt, which I never thought. Anyway, I won't say that.
How prominent is the Egypt mediation role compared to Qatar?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. It's shrouded in mystery, this mediation, isn't it? I spent a lot of time in Qatar, and they've done a great job. I got to know the Prime Minister when I was in the UN, and he's a very measured person and very diligent. But you never really know, do you, about who's doing what, who's attending, and who's saying what in those. It's all shuttle, obviously, but in which room people say what to the parties, and who stands up to those who are not quite parties but are certainly have an interest in what the outcome was, the US in this case. So you don't really know. I think it's an interesting thing because it goes to the heart of my history and my profession of mediation, which is that I know very well from direct experience that mediation doesn't work if it's not discreet. It shouldn't be in the public domain because the parties particularly have to make difficult decisions, or should. So we try to keep it out of the public domain. But mediation is also a publicly accountable good and needs to be, discussed with the media and with the press. I learned about the power of media after my 7 decades of life through Gaza. And how important it was and what my obligations were. And I think that we still see in the case of the Gaza mediation that old-fashioned view, which is keep it quiet. And I think that's true even in Doha, by the way. And I get it, but it's an international issue beyond others, and that means more talking, I think, or explaining what's going on without, reaching into the secrets.
But it doesn't seem to be working either.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is effective or efficient. I've come round very strongly to the view that if you can advise on a conflict, as I hope to do in various conflicts in the Middle East, in my new life, it's partly about telling the truth to the media. The media, as we know, blocked from Sudan, sort of blocked from Gaza, is a peacemaker because it's a record of what is done and what should be done and not done. So, Middle East Eye is a great example of that. Mediators, particularly states, in this new decade of mediation, which has gone back into the hands of governments, away from the sort of people like me and others in the sort of professional world of mediation. Mediation by them is always affected by national interest, not to annoy one or other government, and sometimes that can battle against their obligations to the parties or to the people. And you see this in Qatar. Remember the Prime Minister, who is a great, wonderful person, and I think probably a great mediator, but who knows, was, when they, you remember he said that they'll suspend their mediation with Hamas. And I think that the reason was that they were getting hammered by other governments. The US was very unhappy with what was going on with Hamas and should be more pushy and stuff. And he then kind of retracted. He then said, no, actually, in a few days later, he said, no, but we're still doing it. He was playing out in public a real dilemma for people in his position. I admire him for doing that. But we want truth and accountable statements, so long as it doesn't disrupt the prospects of the people that are affected in Gaza and elsewhere. We need more truth.
What do you make of the current ceasefire negotiations? Where do you see it going?
You see, I think they haven't solved the original problem which bedeviled them in earlier ceasefire negotiations, which is, of course, as you know, about the future. So you can pull off a 60-day ceasefire, perhaps. I don't think it will be pulled off, by ignoring the serious issue of what's happening next. We all know from the ceasefire negotiation in January that it stopped after phase one, predictably, because it didn't move to resolve the question of one side wanting Israel's forces to withdraw from Gaza and the other side wanting to eliminate Hamas. That's what this war is about in small terms. And it hasn't managed to resolve that. And in fact, it's worse now than it was then. The public rhetoric from Tel Aviv and the honest rhetoric from Tel Aviv is, no, we're going to eliminate Hamas. Well, good luck. You need to eliminate the military activities of Hamas, maybe, but you can't eliminate the Palestinian right to their own future, I think. And we think we all know that. So without resolving that central proposition, I can't see it's going to work. As you say, as I said, you could get a 60-day ceasefire, which, by the way, would be a blessing for the people of Gaza, thank God at last, depending on the humanitarian distribution. But it won't end the war if we haven't got this right. And there's a huge difference globally, and not very clearly understood, but having a deal, to use current parlance, having a deal which stops the fighting, saves the people, which is a ceasefire, and having a peace deal, which is something completely different and much more demanding. And ceasefires are great because they aid and people live and they get breathing and they can leave and stuff. But I've run a lot of ceasefires in my life, and I learned one simple pedestrian truth, which was a bad ceasefire takes you backwards because it destroys trust and so forth. So better than a bad ceasefire is no ceasefire. And that's a really, really difficult dilemma for anyone who cares about the people of Palestine. But I think that is not yet being resolved in these negotiations.
Martin, I'd like to go back to your take on the humanitarian situation in Gaza and occupied Palestine. Specifically, I'd like you to explain to our audience and those listening to you right now the extent and the nature of the UN's aid operations in Gaza and the West Bank. Give us an overview of the UN's humanitarian operations in Gaza and the West Bank right now, and which aid organizations play a bigger role. For example, Unrwa compared to the UN's food program or UNICEF, for example.
Thank you for this very easy question. I've tried to sort of get a sense of this, just like you're asking, just like me as an interested person in the public domain, in public, wanting to know the answer. The UN, and let's include in the UN, is always the international NGOs, because there's one extraordinary thing. You talked about me as the emergency relief coordinator. That is a role that includes not just the UN agencies, but all these international agencies. As their coordinator, if you like, as their somewhat leader. So let's call it the UN and humanitarian enterprise. are completely blocked, basically. The recent 170 trucks don't really make a huge difference. We hear daily from them that fuel is running out. We hear daily that antibiotics and other medical supplies is running out. We hear daily that hospitals are being bombed and so on and so forth, and that food kitchens are not getting food. And what surprises, so that's terrible. Um, but what we're not really hearing properly or carefully enough, because it is, I don't think it's really their fault, is that we've heard these worries for such a long time. And so when will a hospital stop? I mean, it's a terrible, surreal question, isn't it? Um, does WFP have still food in their warehouses sufficient to keep going for a month or 2 months, whatever it is? And the reason I think why they don't want to talk about that is to kind of give people a way internationally of sort of saying, oh, well, that's okay. We don't have to do anything until September or something. Fuel and safe water obviously is key, and shelter obviously in these difficult climates. So I don't really know where we are in terms of the precipice. There will be a moment at which there really is nothing in the markets, and the food kitchens will have shut down, and that will be the apocalypse. That's it, done for. The big agencies, Unrwa, of course, is still around, but under huge restriction. And
Is it still the
you know,
largest humanitarian provider?
yeah, I think so. I think so. And they have a huge, and I would claim, talented national staff. I don't know the numbers in Gaza are something like 10 to 14,000, I think, something like that, who have not left. There's all these difficulties for international staff in UNRWA to get in or basically to get out. But the UNRWA backbone has always been the national staff, despite the criticism of them by others. So they are very important because the infrastructure, the schools, we see all these daily bombings of UNRWA schools, as it were, is very important, and they remain very, very, very important, not only in aid terms, but in political terms as the companion to the Palestinian people. WFP, the World Food Programme, has obviously increased in importance, and we see this across the world. We see it in Sudan and so forth and elsewhere, because hunger, whatever your sophistication is also about food. But so WFP is stepping up. I think they are a massive organization. Huge cuts to their budget. Somebody was telling me it could be up to 40% in some calculations of their global budget. And yet they're there. They have their team there. They work hard in Gaza. I think that I grew up in UNICEF back in my very early days, back in Cambodia and elsewhere. So I'm an alumnus. It's my home. So of course I praise it excessively. But what's really interesting for me in terms of this agency differences that you've mentioned is how UNICEF and WHO and ICRC, the health agencies, in a way, have come to the fore. And the story of tragedy in Gaza is being told through medical staff in Gaza. The tragedies facing hospitals has become the front story as an illustration of everything else that's happening. I said something the other day that I think if you want to consider a Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of Gaza, you should give it to the medical staff in Gaza. I think they have a right to that. So I think they're very, very important. Tedros, the head of WHO, who's going through his own dreadful difficulties of cuts, I think has been a withering advocate in great terms.
What's the cause of these cuts at the World Health Organization and the World Food Program?
The cause?
Yeah, why are there
with the US funding.
these cuts?
Basically, it's US funding cuts, and World Food Program particularly affected because, of course, as you know, they had a reliance on US funding and US gifts in kind of food from their agricultural economy. And this is being, not this year, I think, but next year it'll be very brutal.
So are these cuts linked to the Donald Trump administration specifically.
Yeah, indeed. I think so. There's an argument, as you know, about whether the humanitarian community, I look at myself in this, as to whether the humanitarian community was thoughtful enough to actually expect these cuts before the inauguration in January, but also not to become too large. Very large headquarters in places like Geneva and Rome and elsewhere. Large staffs, a lot being laid off now. Also by OCHA, my and Tom's place of work. UNHCR is, going to release thousands, I believe, IOM and so forth. So it wasn't quite a tragedy waiting to happen, but it was a tragedy that did happen, and the consequence is known.
Unrwa, which is the UN's agency for Palestinian refugees, has been the target of probably the most devastating funding cuts after the withdrawal of American funding. I interviewed Unrwa's Commissioner General in Geneva a couple of months ago, and he suggested that the agency is actually operating with a negative cash flow, and that the funding crisis right now may eventually force him to take difficult decisions, which basically he explained, saying he may have to deprioritize some services provided by Unrwa. I'm curious to know from you, as a previous UN insider, how much support Unrwa has within the UN system as an organization, particularly after the withdrawal of US funding.
I think it's a great question, because UNRWA, there's something called the Interagency Standing Committee that you probably have heard of. Tom Fletcher now chairs it, I used to, which is all the humanitarian agency heads, UN and international NGOs, and we met fairly regularly to make decisions about what we should do next. UNRWA was never on that committee historically, and still isn't, because of a rather, I think, specious reason, because they're not global. Well, they certainly do humanitarian work enough to qualify, in my view. But anyway, they're not in that. So it was at the beginning of the war, when I was the emergency relief coordinator, I spent a lot of time with Philippe Lazzarini, who is a close friend, by the way, of mine for many years. And I did this with the heads of key agencies to see if we could help UNRWA go through the plague that it was suffering. And the issue was whether other agencies could take up certain services. And I realized in talking to Philippe over those months, the first months of 2024, that it was premature to think of those terms, because it would look as if UNRWA's selling out, and on the back foot, because of those odious allegations from Israel about October the 7th. But it's the first part of the answer to your question, because we gathered to collect, to save and preserve and support UNRWA. And then there's a report by Ian Martin, which looks at this issue again of the services and their cost and who's best to do it. And I know Philippe, by the way, directly, personally, has been talking about this for years in UNRWA, because UNRWA was always underfunded. It was always having a negative cash flow. It was always difficult at the end of the calendar year to pay their staff. It was in real trouble, and others among us, including, by the way, OCHA, stumped up loans to get them through the cold season, the hungry season. So that's the first thing. Secondly, UNRWA is created by the General Assembly, as you know, not different from many other organizations. And it has the support largely of the General Assembly, which is a larger, inclusive, obviously, council than others. It has a bit more of a difficult job with the council, Security Council, but we know why. But it has full support from the General Assembly and indeed always from the Secretary General. So in the UN Secretariat, in the agencies, in the staff of the United Nations that I was a part of, there was no hesitation to acknowledge, first of all, that UNRWA is irreplaceable. Secondly, that it is irreplaceable as a companion of the Palestinian future. Secondly, that it was irreplaceable as the main backbone of aid. We always sent it into Gaza and occupied territories, and that it was in serious trouble. And I think Philippe, obviously, who's a great, relentless traveler and advocate, went to everywhere and started to persuade governments to stop this nonsense of defunding. But I think many of us, the rest of us, were there to help. But it was left to Philippe primarily because he represented not just UNRWA, but he represented in UN terms, the plight of the Palestinians to do that. So very much support. I think what the dilemma now is, just finally, is that what's the future? Because of the Knesset rulings making it difficult for UNRWA staff to move in and out, who's going to run the schools? Who's going to distribute the food? Probably WFP. But it needs to be done in a way which is organized and approved by the Secretary General and the General Assembly. That's why I think this report by Ian Martin is so important. I don't know its conclusions. I think there have been some appearances of their report in the media, but we need to do that. We need to see the future of UNRWA in a way that's publicly accountable and not just, well, let's help out here. It's really important for the UN. They must not desert any of their institutions, including the ICC and others.
Do you think it will survive the funding crisis?
I think so. I think it will. I hope it will, but I think it will. I mean, interesting to know from the private sector funding, which is never a big deal for UNRWA, but it's escalated during this bad period by 2 or 3 times more, with money coming in from foundations and individuals all over the world, almost not asked for, because of the conscience that we all have, the Palestinian people. UNRWA has the unshakable mandate and unique task of preserving the rights of return and shepherding and supporting the two-state solution. Nobody else has that. Nobody else has that responsibility in the United Nations. It comes from the General Assembly. So I think they will survive because there's a passion for this. And we all know perfectly well there'll be no peace in the Middle East without that solution.
What's the role of Gulf Arab states in particular in addressing this funding crisis? None of the biggest donors to Unrwa now are Gulf Arab states. Why do you think that's the case? And do you think they do have an obligation and a responsibility to make up for the lack of US funding?
I think so. I think they do. We all do, by the way, not just the Gulf states. But obviously, it's very much a Gulf Arab matter, isn't it? And they certainly have the resources. And I think largely they have increasingly, during the course of this war, become a force for support to the two-state solution. Saudi Arabia has stayed strong about it, others in different ways. But I think to the heart of that, and that's why this conference in New York will also be important, we will see people having to stand up for their support. And you're in Norway. Earlier in the war, made a spectacularly courageous decision to provide funding for the Palestinian Authority, given that they weren't getting their normal income from the Israeli authorities. As you remember, there was always a certain amount of funds transfer from Tel Aviv for administration of territory. And Norway stepped up. And I think that's the thing that we'll probably see more of now, because the horror is so obvious. The future is so important to all those Gulf states. We see the links so much more clearly now between Palestine and Syria and Lebanon, obviously, and how peace will not come unless, and Jordan is under great pressure, peace will not come without addressing this. Certainly separately, but then with a view to the mutual security that is essential for all those Gulf states. UNRWA is essential to that, I believe.
Martin, can you touch on the situation in the West Bank right now?
I'm not very good at this, but I'll have a go.
I just particularly would like to hear from you whether we are seeing a Gaza scenario unfolding right now in the West Bank with what is widely considered as the ethnic cleansing of refugee camps there.
Yeah, one of the, I think again, a very good question. I think that one of the slightly less honourable aspects of this international focus on Palestine is, for reasons we perfectly understand, the focus is on Gaza. After all, that's the focal point, the central gravity of the war. While West Bank is being treated quite extraordinarily badly, wrongly, illegally, by the Israeli settlers and their military. And we see it every day. And it doesn't reach the level of the story that Gaza reaches, because Gaza's figures and pictures and tragedies are so much more dramatic. So I think what we're seeing in West Bank is a massively politically important operation to move the Palestinians out. I remember Secretary General Guterres saying to me, this is all eventually about Palestine in the West Bank, because that's, Judea and Samaria, as Israel calls it. That's the heartland. I think there's very good work still being done by international agencies to try to defend and protect the Palestinians there, but it's largely under the radar. I don't think you do get some. UK has been very good on this, on statements about the West Bank. But seeing the freedom with which the settlers are able to simply bomb a village and move people out so they can go in and farm. How bad is that? It's extraordinary. It's a bit like Israel going in and bombing Sueda, which is I last remember as a foreign country. It's called Syria, and deciding on who polices it. So I think the West Bank is a threat to our conscience.
Martin, concerning attacks on the United Nations in Gaza, to what extent has Israel destroyed UN infrastructure in Gaza, based on the knowledge that you have from the ground, and how many of its staff have been killed?
I've been astonished by the fact that all the attacks that Israel has done, and there are legion, there are many, on UN infrastructure, Unrwa infrastructure particularly, of course, particularly in Gaza, also somewhat in Jerusalem, as we know, but also in the West Bank, has not been followed up. If somebody bombs your house where I'm living, in the safe state of Switzerland, you go around to the local police and say, can you find the perpetrator and put him up in the court and, compensate me? That's not happening. And these are crimes against international infrastructure, sanctioned and approved by the United Nations in New York, and therefore by all the member states of the UN, so for all 150 or so. So it's quite remarkable, isn't it, that this kind of stuff gets lost in translation, and that we don't see that. Philippe Lazzarini argues about it a lot, obviously, because he has a duty of care for that, including the killing of his staff, which I don't know the numbers at the moment. Is it 300?
It's over 300.
It's over 300 UN staff, mostly UNRWA, and it's the worst of any place ever in history in terms of aid workers getting killed. They're blooming, hugely increasing in numbers in other parts of the world, of course, at the same time, because of the common problem of impunity. But Gaza is a killing ground. And that video that we saw of the Palestinian Red Crescent and one UN person being killed, and then mass graves and lies afterwards, tells it all for me. It's shocking. And they killed mostly, the UNRWA staff, national staff, are mostly killed in their homes, which also kills their family. I think that's a statistic that's sometimes forgotten. So I think that the UN, writ large in that sense, the governing organs of the United Nations, have something to account for in this. It's their infrastructure, basically. It's our infrastructure, yours and mine. And it's just sort of casually tossed aside, bombing a school in Unrwa and then claiming there was, of course, Hamas underneath is the easiest thing to do in the world. Now we can bomb churches and do the same thing. You can't do that in a proper world without, first of all, a discussion, some rhetoric from interested leaders around the world, an investigation, and justice, because it breeds impunity. The more you don't do it, the more likely it is it will be done again. We have a very poor record in the killing of global humanitarian aid workers, of not following up on finding out their killers and finding justice for their families. It's particularly so true in my community, the humanitarian community, and their agencies. It's a global problem. It's growing. It's growing because the world is going that way, as you know, and everything we've talked about says so. But not to do it, it's what every lawyer tells you, isn't it? If you don't treat the first crime, the crimes will increase. And do you remember in New York that Mayor Rudy Giuliani, many years ago, focused his efforts as mayor on people who cross the road illegally? Do you remember on jaywalking? Because he said, this is the first battleground, and we can go from there. I know you won't want to put this out, but I'm not saying Unrwa is like jaywalking, so please don't do this to me. We haven't done well, and we still have to do well because it's not over, and those people are still suffering from those acts.
Have there been any similar attacks on different situations where you worked on United Nations infrastructure or personnel on such a scale elsewhere compared to Gaza?
Not on such a scale, I think, because Gaza is a very geographically limited, in terms of size. It's a sort of killing ground and deportation and displacement ground now. And frankly, the reporting coming out of there, despite the problems, is very good and very immediate. So I think Gaza has become a sort of terrible example of the worst of man in doing this. But it's also true elsewhere. I remember the huge attack in eastern Afghanistan some years ago on an MSF hospital, which was just attacked by one of the Taliban or other factions and taken out, and lots of people killed. So they're easy targets. I think what they're protected by, UN infrastructure and places like hospitals, is of course international law. But more importantly than that, sorry to say, it's by the fact that anybody in a war wants health facilities to save their people and to save the people. It's remarkable, I think, how hospitals in Gaza have become, first of all, the front line of the story, but secondly, have survived 21 months despite this pummeling by the invading forces. So, and that goes for UN infrastructure. Obviously, a hospital is a lot more valuable than an office of some agency in a capital. I lived in Syria in the UN for some time, 12 years ago, and we were never bombed while the city was bombed every day. And I think that's partly because there's a sort of reticence to do the UN. But that reticence is diminishing now, given the current attitude towards the United Nations.
You've mentioned investigations as a means of addressing what you describe as impunity or lack of accountability.
Yeah.
So why has the UN not taken any legal action, for example, to investigate? Were you referring to investigations at the UN level or, for example, at the ICC or national prosecutions of officials who should be held responsible for these attacks?
Well, I'm puzzled by this too. I know the argument and I kind of understand it and support it, which is these investigations are legal investigations. It should be independent, not from the UN, and independently commissioned and independently carried out. That's what we have courts for, and so forth. but it'll also be an obligation put on Israel by the United Nations. I'm just not sure it's an either or, to be honest, whether it's only outside actors or linked actors like ICJ and ICC. Because ICC has been straightforward enough about this. And ICJ is, in the process of deciding on genocide as an obligation of their duty to their staff. There must be a reason. I'm not sure I know.
Well, the UN, there is now the advisory opinion case being examined before the International Court of Justice, which itself is a major legal development, and
Yes.
it's focused mainly on the privileges and immunities of United Nations
Yes.
facilities and the illegality of the ban imposed on Unrwa, for example, within Israel.
Yes.
So we shall see what the outcome of this advisory opinion is. How significant do you think this advisory opinion case is for the future of accountability for any attacks on the United Nations, and in particular on Unrwa?
It's huge, I think. It's massive. I'm a huge fan of the courage and persistence and focus and lack of legal obfuscation of the International Court of Justice. Law is not a quick process, as we all know from all our lives. And they came out, was it in May or in mid-2024 with their initial provisional measures, which I thought was still very clear and imposed these obligations on states. And now they're going, into the heart of it. And I think the argument, of course, from the United Nations proper, as it were, the Secretariat, the organs of the United Nations system, is that that's the job of the ICJ. They will do it with immaculate neutrality, excellent lawyers, and a right to do it and a mandate to do it. And in a sense, it shouldn't be muddled with other efforts of the kind I was describing just now. I think the International Court of Justice has risen to the occasion very, very effectively. And it's for people like me in my previous job, and certainly now, it provides a bulwark against people who just say, you're wrong, the law is different. There's no higher court than the International Court of Justice. And, bless them for what they're doing, because they do bring together the highest level of legal knowledge, but in a purposeful way, not in a vacant way. When I was talking about genocide, as you know, I was not very popular with some for a while. And, I found refuge, if you like, in the opinions of this august court. It's there set up for a purpose. It was set up, I think, in the time of Kofi Annan, who also was there for the setting up of the International Criminal Court. And we can't do without them.
Are you optimistic that the advisory opinion will have any impact on UN operations in Gaza and occupied Palestine?
I think it'll have a long-term impact because it will be a stone in the wall, Immediate impact, I doubt. I mean, all the evidence is the contrary at the moment, isn't it? That the perpetrators of these crimes, if they are made crimes, are not interested and are derisive of what opinions may happen by these entities, these courts. So I don't think it's going to have an immediate impact. I think President Trump and his administration are very clear about their view of the International Court of Justice, sadly. So it won't, but it's an incredibly important legal precedent, and it will never go away. I don't think it will lead to saving lives immediately in Palestine, tragically, which is what it's intended to do. But it will empower international opinion and the views of certain governments to not let this pass.
I was in The Hague when the hearings were taking place. I was covering this. I was covering the hearings, and even though the U.S. and Hungary were completely against the arguments presented by the UN and other participating countries, the number of states that participated in proceedings is quite significant. It's over 30 states, including the UK, including France.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the UK's argument was quite rigorous and was quite clear on the illegality of attacks, including on Unrwa. The UK representative clearly said that Unrwa is impartial and neutral, and the majority of participating states argued for an advisory opinion that would confirm the illegality of attacks and the legal ban on Unrwa. So that's quite significant. I mean, if we do not view the world as Trump's world or the U.S. The U.S. world, so there is a consensus even amongst Western states.
I think so, and credit to the UK, because within this, as it were, because they were there, as you said, and you saw them. Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is a lawyer, of course, with a long practice of law and prosecution. Others in his cabinet are equally, seized with the idea of legal obligations, and they've stuck up to it. And they brought back funding for Unrwa when they came into power last July. And I think we should never forget that. And they spoke publicly about support for the International Court of Justice as well as the Criminal Court. Not necessarily a popular move, for some of their allies, but incredibly important. That's the sort of speaking up which is important, as you say, for the 30 countries, but then for the world. It's also important to address the immediate, in rhetoric and then in action, address the immediate transgressions, I think. Don't wait forever.
What was your reaction when you heard the news that the US government is imposing sanctions on the UN's Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese?
Even in this world of horror, I was deeply shocked by that. I know this lady, Francesca Albanese, and have admired her, for her term, and I often speak to her about what we think is happening, and she's always incredibly helpful. And she's the most courageous woman in many ways that I know, because of course they're death threats, and this happens. The brutal and casual sanctioning of somebody who is employed by the UN to do what she has done is quite extraordinary to me. Obviously, I take it personally as well. She's doing the right thing. That's what the Human Rights Council set up the Special Rapporteur job for, was to find out about this. Just because you don't like what she's found out, as obviously the US doesn't, it certainly doesn't justify this kind of punitive, dismissive response. I am shocked by it, because I think it's just another ramping up of a very, very unfriendly world. And I was in humanitarian operations for many years, including obviously the most recent. And what we find as we go around to all the war zones and places of need and famine in the world, as I had the opportunity and privilege to do, is how incredibly generous people are to their neighbors. It's a truism. It's not a bragging rhetoric that the first responders to, for example, people who have to flee their homes and are displaced either inside their country or outside, are the people where they flee to. And those villages, whether it's in Tigray or Burkina Faso or elsewhere, bankrupt themselves to help these new unexpected neighbors. And they explain it. I've asked them this everywhere. They explain it very easily. Tom Fletcher talks about it. How would we manage if we didn't help? What is humanity if we don't do the least that is obvious before our eyes? That hasn't gone away. Leaders in the world have gone away from that. But the great majority of people, I think, and I believe from evidence, have not changed one whit from these fundamental decencies. I've written about it happening in a place I visited in Burkina Faso, where the mothers of this community risked their lives to cross the lines of Al Qaeda to feed these displaced people because neither of them had any food left. They got leaves from across the battle lines. Every night they went out. Incredible, incredible. Look at the emergency rooms in Sudan and their bravery and so forth. So we have a lot to honor in this world, is a lot to decry.
How can the UN protect Albanese? You've clearly expressed your rejection of the sanctions decision, but what has the UN done? Do you think the Secretary General has responded appropriately to this major historic precedent?
I think it's a job for the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. They created her post. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, was supporting her, like all the other rapporteurs that are created by the Council. This is an intergovernmental body. They should respond, because this is the act of one government.
How should they respond?
Well, they should speak out about it for a start. They should not support it in any forum. They should lobby through their embassies in Washington. They should make a collective coalition of people, of states who see this as utterly wrong and completely opposed to international norms and law and order. I think the Council has the obligation first. I think Secretary General Guterres, I know him quite well now from my time in the UN, is hugely aggrieved by this because he's passionate. He was a former prime minister, as we know, of Portugal, a socialist prime minister. He's passionate about these values, and he's of course spoken out very, very clearly about Gaza. But I think it needs to start with the Human Rights Commission.
There were suggestions that her case could actually be brought before the ICJ due to her diplomatic immunity as well.
Why not, right? And you saw what happened to her when she went to Germany. She was almost arrested when she went into Parliament. And I think the UN there intervened with the former Foreign Minister, Madame Baerbock, to stop it before she was taken away to jail. An astonishing thing. She had similar experiences in Switzerland. The privileges and immunities, I think, is a very interesting opportunity. It's a bedrock of safety, actually, for most of us who've had the privilege of being in the UN. And it needs to be extended further to non-UN, of course. That would be a great thing. She needs all the support. We can never, ever let that woman down for what she's done for us.
Martin, I want to turn to Sudan right now, which is often described as the most neglected or forgotten humanitarian crisis in the world. Describe the humanitarian situation as it stands in Sudan right now, and talk about why the world is ignoring this crisis.
I think it gets the prize. That's a terrible thing to say, for being the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world today. 500,000 children killed, I recently saw, in this war. 8 million, displaced and had to leave their country for others, become refugees. Famine, which is of course increasing now. We're coming into the planting season. It'll get worse. Huge number of attacks on aid workers. MSF has played an extraordinary role in Darfur and elsewhere, as usual, in having the courage to go there, contrary to the arguments of the government, and help people, and then get killed in the process, along with huge numbers of civilians. And it's not getting any better. Funding is very low. I don't know the percentage at the moment, but I think it's very, very low about the total. UN is based in Port Sudan, as you know, and is often accused of this making it look biased. And one of the problems in Sudan is the two warring parties, the RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces, are, and it goes to the heart of your last point, are not seen as equal. The government of Sudan sees, of course, the Sudanese armed forces as the government, not as a party. And the RSF is a renegade, armed group who can do no right. That has also impeded both humanitarian operations, especially out of Port Sudan, visas for people in humanitarian organizations to go to the heart of darkness, which is Darfur, are very difficult to get. The deputy head of the humanitarian operation in Sudan, former UNHCR person, had to leave. He was declared persona non grata because he'd come across the border from Chad, as he needed to do. So it's a very, very vicious place where people are dying in numbers that we don't even know. No media, for the reasons it's just standard and obvious, but tragic. And a civil society and a civilian ambition to reclaim their country from these warriors is largely disregarded. They have a prime minister there now, the Sudanese Armed Forces appointed Kamel Idris, who we know very well here in Geneva from his time in the UN in Geneva. But the heart of the problem, obviously, is what's the outcome? We saw this in Gaza. We discussed it. What's going to be the outcome of this? Who's going to want what? How do we align the objectives of the war between those parties? And in Sudan, the mediation hasn't been able to get to that obviously central but difficult point. And that, I think, is a key priority. So it's humanitarian access to be negotiated, I think led by the United Nations. I think that's what Tom Fletcher thinks. I think he's right. I would do the same. Secondly, stop the inattention of the world to boost funding to that, at least. And then thirdly, start doing real mediation on the outcome.
Who's to blame for the lack of humanitarian aid, the obstruction of humanitarian aid, in your view? Is it the government or is it the rapid support forces?
I think they're both to blame. I mean, they're both, liable for killing civilians in hospitals and bombing hospitals and clinics and displacement camps and so forth. I wouldn't want to choose between them. I think they both have very different obligations and missions, but what they're doing is destroying their country and their people through their striving to eliminate the other.
And how do you see the role of external factors? Is it making the situation worse? Like, for example, the involvement of the United Arab Emirates in the conflict?
Well, I think, the mediation, the Jeddah process, which has morphed, as you know, into the Alps process, so-called, still with Sudan, I think, as the leading convener, now with the US back engaged. But in its second stage, including the UAE and Egypt and others, it's a dilemma. It's a historic dilemma for mediation. Given what I think is the broad general truth, which is that mediation is now led by governments, and relevantly by governments with interests and leverage to a certain crisis, hence Egypt, UAE, Sudan, African Union, and so forth. You would need to include the United Arab Emirates. I think they have extraordinary opportunities to help one of the parties, at least, try to make a difference. I've talked to them about that last year when I was in Abu Dhabi with the foreign minister and others. It's a real opportunity, and so I would have included them too if I was the god of mediation. And I think they can do good. What's lacking, I think, is an alignment on what we're trying to get out of this. These states, those involved, those sort of cited mediators, they haven't managed to address the issue of the future, the outcome, the exit, end state. And without that, they lack a sort of central purpose, and it's true in many parts of the world. Afghanistan and others are the same. But with that, they could actually become aligned on a practical solution. So I'm glad they're in together. I think they need to be helped to get the parties to focus on where they see an outcome.
That's a very diplomatic answer from a diplomat, understandably. You resigned last year, Martin, citing health reasons. Was your resignation linked in any way to any external pressure, or was it related to your position on Gaza? Or were you feeling frustrated at the time?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't due to those sort of elements. I mean, it was essentially, there's two things that were very important for me. One, I was very sick with long COVID, and I didn't realize, frankly, until 6 months after I'd left, I had been sick from it in the last 6 months as well. And that was just due to a lot of traveling. Obviously, I got COVID like everybody else and so forth. So nothing dramatic or life-threatening. I also wanted to live with my family, who are based in Geneva and have been based here for a long time, and I hadn't lived with them for 6, 7, or 8 years. This is something we all feel, isn't it? I mean, we're all displaced from our homes and our families, and so I'm just being selfish, saying I'd like to quite do that myself, and that didn't seem to be possible for the UN to move me to Geneva. So I left, but I had been thinking about leaving for the previous year and a half. I talked quite a bit to the Secretary General about it because I had a period in my life when I was lucky enough to help found the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a big mediation foundation now, very large globally, I think the biggest, based here in Geneva. And I'd worked on that as their director for a decade. And I found the fascination of doing mediation from a free world perspective, if you like, not being an official. There's ups and downs of it, but particularly now, there's a need for that kind of work because, as we see in Sudan, as we see in Gaza, as we see in Afghanistan, and even Syria in a different way, we're not getting the professional work under the radar, deniable often, to help find answers to conflicts rather than deals for conflicts. And I just wanted to do that. I wanted to go back to that sort of part of my life. So I was also being selfish.
But are you satisfied with what you've accomplished during your time as a UN humanitarian aid chief?
God, what a difficult question.
What were the limits to your work? Talk about the challenges. Why was it so difficult to carry out your work?
It was difficult to carry out the work because there were so many crises, and Tom Fletcher has the same problem, desperately trying to choose which one to spend time in and visit and do something about, not just visit, but actually do something about it. So you're constantly frustrated. It's back to the point we were making earlier about frontline aid workers hate failing because, there's not aid or whatever. And I felt always diminished by the fact that there were many places that I never went to the Congo, the DRC, for example. I grew up in the DRC. I should certainly have gone there and tried to think of things to make it better. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine mediating the Black Sea deal. So that was, a great experience. But I think my real regret is what's happened since. And it's linked to what happened then. It's not, you're not lucky not to be in it. So you are lucky not to be in it now. And it's about the degree to which the humanitarian compact with the international community was eroding, not just President Trump, and the degree to which funding was not being imaginatively looked at, and the degree to which overpopulating and growing humanitarian agencies was not seen as a stoppage, it was seen as an opportunity. And I played my part in not being very clear about the future. I was involved on behalf of the Secretary General, really being a troubleshooter in crisis. I'd been a mediator in Yemen, got to know the Secretary General very well from that before I came to OCHA, and I had this background in mediation. So I was very involved in that. Black Sea is the obvious thing. And I enjoyed it, partly because the great thing that happens when you go to war zones or crises is what I talked about earlier, the humanity that you see in your face. But you also have the frustration of knowing you're not going to solve it. you've got to do it. You've got to do something. You've got to find a pathway. You've got to talk to the bad people. I did a lot of talking to bad people, and I always have in my life since the Khmer Rouge. So I felt very, very privileged, hugely privileged in that role. I think it's amazing. I can't see why it was me. But it was wonderful and awful in all extreme forms at the same time.
If you meet Secretary General Antonio Guterres today, what advice would you give him regarding the situation in Gaza and Sudan?
I think I would give him advice on Sudan, let's say, because in a way it's not simpler, but it's tortured, but on defining the future of the country, defining the role of civil society and civilians in the future. He's got a personal envoy for this, Ramtane Lamamra, as you know, from Algeria originally, who we've all worked with, who's an exceptional mediator and political diplomat. But for Antonio Guterres, I think he should use the weapons and assets of the UN system to try to bring together for the mediators, not replacing them, the ideas of the end state. And I'm told recently that the two parties would actually be very interested in that. They're looking for that. They're not foolish. They see the need, even as the war is unresolved, and particularly because it's unresolved. In Gaza, I think the same thing, but as he said, those months ago, he said Israel won't allow the UN anywhere near this. And I'm sure that goes for the US as well. But there are ways to become more political in the Gaza situation. Support for the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, he's supporting the two-state solution meeting later this month. I think that's essential to, his primary duty, of course, is peace and security. That's his top purpose, terms of reference. And he's passionate about it. I know this from Ukraine. Ukraine, I think also, by the way, I know it's high level, US and others and so forth involved in the mediation between Russia and Ukraine, but doesn't mean to say there isn't a role for the UN with its norms and disinterested experience. Even then, I believe, and I talk a lot to Ukrainians and indeed to Russians recently about this sort of thing. Don't ever think that somewhere is overcrowded until you really find out the truth as to whether it is overcrowded for a real purpose or overcrowded just in the public mind. And I think you normally find that it's the first rather than the second.
Martin, on that note, thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure having you.
It was great. Thank you. I hope we meet.
Thank you. Me too. Take care.
Great.